Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my two guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Hello, Arnie. Good to be with you again.
No worries. Pleased to have you, Robert. Occasionally I noted your camera is pixelating, so we might be struggling with bandwidth, but hopefully the audio will be reliable.
Again.
No worries. And Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Hi there, Arnie. We're struggling here in Canada with this literally almost imponderable situation. We've heard, well, that's part of the discussion.
No worries. No worries. Okay. I'm going to cut across to front page of the Australian, and I'm just going to highlight, in my mind, the most salient points in regard to what's going on in Australia. The first is that the level of debts that our governments are incurring. Now, it's mentioning here that Queensland, the level of debt, Queensland is a state of about 5 million, I think, 3.5 to 5 million, and it's got a debt of $100,000 million, and it's going through the roof since the lockdown. So let's place that on the table. Government debt, the taxpayer has to actually pay that back, is going through the roof. The second is that the Victorian government, the lockdown lifting, is being delayed, deferred, and they're saying it's being fast-tracked, but in actual fact, I read the reports and it's not. It's actually going to extend through at least until late October, if not Christmas. And what is actually happening in Victoria at the moment is the business councils, the different employer groups and things like that are reporting that their cash flow crisis is so great that businesses should leave Victoria. It's an absolute basket case. The economy has been lunched. Now, I put it to the floor, I put it to my audience, this audience today, that this is a deliberate policy. The level of indebtedness is going through the roof. So on one hand, you've got government debt, which the taxpayer has to clear, government debt going through the roof. You've got government-imposed lockdown, so the economy can't work, can't function. The cash flow is actually ceased. And here it is, they're extending it further. So it's a deliberate policy to destroy the middle class. Now, this is not unprecedented. This is a standard operating procedure for a communist revolution. A standard operating procedure. Don't think I'm not being overdramatic here. This is real. I know people who are in industry in Victoria and they are shuttering up their businesses. They are shuttering it up because it's just impossible for them to recover from this situation. And this isn't isolated. This is rampant. This is endemic through the whole state. That government there is imposing lockdowns. They have lunched the economy. The levels of debt are going through the roof, which means that somehow or other, the taxpayer has to now bridge that ever-widening gap between how much tax they can afford and how much tax is going to be extracted from them. We're watching a civilizational collapse right in front of us. And it's to me, it is a dire situation, and there is no voice offering any alternatives to this predicament. No voice at all. I can't hear it. I can't hear it from the Conservatives, certainly not from the Liberals. Our federal government is Liberal, or if you like, supposedly Conservative, but I would put it more in line with totalitarian Liberal, Libertarian, and the state government is Socialist Labor. So they're both totalitarian. Both governments, the federal and state governments, are both totalitarian, and they are lunching our economy. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, I hope people realize that the financial power that controls society and has for centuries is utterly ruthless. It has done terrible things to different nations through time. You know, the hyperinflation in Germany after the First World War, that was a deliberate policy. Now, it was in part designed to allow the Germans to get out of a preposterous debt obligation that was imposed on them in the Versailles Treaty, or events around the Versailles Treaty. But The same sort of thing happened in the Soviet Union. There was a fantastic inflation, dispossession of people, and then the government took over and they were running everything. They had centralized planning, and they had taken control of the production of food and every other kind of industrial production. And they didn't do it very well because that wasn't their expertise. Their expertise was in exerting power and executing people, imprisoning people. So the thing is that the financial system is a trap. It has been a trap all along. It's the effect of it has been to develop fantastic debts in virtually every country. I don't know if there were maybe some oil-rich countries that escaped that a bit, but for some weird reason, every country is massively in debt. Well, they're not in debt to each other so much as they seem to be in debt to people who lend financial credit. And we're all in the same boat. So that system has always been a trap. And now we see that there seems to be a long-range strategy, a policy behind it all. And the trap has been sprung. In springing the trap, now with all these massive borrowings that have been done in order to allegedly help people through this COVID crisis, now this is just another trap because it's just a way of taking some of the heat that would have come on the government if they had shut everything down completely from one day to the next. But that day is coming. It's a day of reckoning. It's going to be dreadful. So, well, they've revealed that they have an infinite capacity to create credit, because before this COVID crisis, we were all strapped for cash. All the governments were saying they didn't have the means to fix a pothole in the road. And then suddenly they can borrow in Canada $350 billion from one day to the next, which added over 50% to our national debt, like in a day. And the same thing in the United States. I think it was $6 trillion that they added to the debt there, just like that. Well, where does this money come from? Very interesting question. It wasn't there before, and suddenly it's accessible to governments. And the governments are undoubtedly using it to push through policies that aren't related to COVID, that are more related to their plans to centralize power and expropriate people's property. But that money hadn't existed, suddenly it exists. So it's just a demonstration of this power of credit creation out of nothing. It's out of thin air. They create the credit merely by saying it exists, writing some figures down or putting them into a computer. And this, I think, is an interesting aspect of our situation because it has been exposed. And there's always been an attempt to keep the public confused about where money comes from. So that I think can no longer be regarded as a matter of dispute because of the policy they've applied here. So I think the fact that the financial system is a racket that somehow our politicians have handed all the controls of society over to. You will not hear a politician criticize the financial system. They will criticize maybe some aspects of financial policy, but they will never criticize the fundamental operation of the system because they know that to do so would be the end of their political careers. But now I think we have an opportunity to reveal this and well, let's hope that we can affect some fundamental changes in the system. And we're not talking about going back to the system that existed in January. In January, everybody was complaining about the financial state of affairs too. Well, there's no reason for this. We're living in a time of absolutely material abundance where any kind of serious productive challenge was met and problems have been solved. There are no serious production problems, and we should be benefiting from that and having a standard of life that accords with our potential to provide the material things that we need in order to live. So let's hope that this shakeup in the financial system will lead to some critical thinking, some original thinking, and that we can, for once and all, get rid of the overlay of financial dictatorship that we've had to live with for decades.
Thank you for that, Robert. I noted you're pixelating, but your audio came through very clearly, and I really appreciate your contribution. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
Yes, Arnie. I think that, it's very important. It's not important, it's critical that somehow we impress upon people that what we're facing is a reign of fear, terror, and it is nothing more than a specter. It's an artificial thing. Has nothing to do with reality. It's a representation of reality, allegedly, but a representation which totally is false. And how can any rational person imagine that one year you are having an industrial system that is pouring out goods, and even though it's not sound because it's an inflationary financial system, but it is nevertheless functioning to create an abundance of things for human beings. And then all of a sudden, the situation turns. We have that interrupted. We have the supply chain shrunk, and nothing has changed. Nothing has changed in terms of physical realities, nothing whatsoever. Except that, as time goes on, we just learn how more and more to do things more efficiently and to produce more and more. So we are being captive to a delusion which is being encouraged by those in power, the financial powers especially I'm talking about, and the media that is concentric with it, to be discouraged, to be frightened, to be dispossessed, and yet we remain unable, it seems, to respond to the situation by just bringing it to an end, because that's all that's required. It's a matter of understanding and will. We are being deluded. We're being bombarded with false information, which is nothing more than a means to lead us into enslavement. A reduction of our standard of living, conditioned to comply with external orders, and to comply because of fear that if you don't comply, you will no longer be able to live. It's a dreadful thing that is being done to us, and the important thing is to understand that there is no reason at all. Douglas said, he was talking about the completion or the pursuing of certain industrial projects. Particularly, he was working in London on the post office tube system, I think, at this time. He said that they're going along famously, producing it, creating it. Then all of a sudden, an order would come through to lay off the men because they didn't have any more money. But he also observed that whenever war was impending or a thing that was to be prepared for or to be pursued, money flowed like water. It just flowed like a torrent without restraint. And he thought that was extremely odd. And I think any intelligent, even moderately intelligent person would find it strange. But of course, explaining the nature of the situation is a more technical matter, and it can't be solved just by philosophical speculations. It's got to be dealt with objectively for what it is, and for what it is as a system and how it operates to cause these extreme gyrations in our economy. So it's, yes, we're going through a revolution. This is a major revolutionary assault on the Western world, and particularly on Christianity, because you'll notice that Christianity is always a major target. Anything to detract from it, to take away from its heritage, to degrade it, to ridicule it, to discredit it altogether is the general tenor of the media, and it's malicious and destructive, and intentionally so. And because Christians have not really formulated their ideas about Christianity in a disciplined manner, in a practical manner, with regard to the everyday affairs of their lives, they are extremely vulnerable to attack because they just don't know how to implement genuine Christian policies in their organic affairs. And so they take a beating. They just sit there and take a beating. They make all sorts of moral and ethical pronouncements and even challenges and complaints, but when it comes down to actually dealing specifically, especially with the financial system, which is the engine of everything, which it controls all human activity ultimately, they are virtually mute. So it's something that is very essential that people come to a disciplined understanding of the nature of the economy and the financial system under which it operates and groans. And if something is going to be done that is really of permanent value in making changes.
Beautifully put, Wally. That's that to me is it's actually putting your faith into action. Thy kingdom come, yes, on earth as it is in heaven. It's a profound point to take. But the fact is that the earth is groaning, not the physical earth, the intellectual earth. Man's mind is groaning. We are going through convulsion after convulsion after convulsion. This century has been a century of convulsions, whether it was Y2K or it was 9/11 or it was COVID or SARS or the hole in the ozone layer, climate, all these sorts of supposed convulsions, none of them real. And we've gone through this. And here it is, the COVID-19 convulsion. And we're still being fooled. We're being fooled. We're not recognising that the instrument of the financial power is the mainstream media. And Wallace, you mentioned that they're concentric, they're together, they are one and the same thing. The mainstream media is actually an outworking of the policy or the purpose, the propaganda, if you like, the brainwashing from the financial system. That's what it's about. That's what it's doing. And we're experiencing that every single day, unrelenting from them. I've offered my balcony to anyone and everyone, and I'll offer it again. Who wants to get their TV and drop it off the balcony, they're more than welcome. And if there's a queue, well, good luck to it. Just take what's left out of the front yard once you've done it, because I think you do well to do that, to actually turn it off and stop going into a state of semi-hypnosis by the TV, because that's what happens. You actually are in a state of semi-hypnosis, whether it's news or it's a movie, product placement or themes or subliminal messages. This level of interference with your actual cognitive thinking, it really, really is important to actually deconstruct it so that you can look at the real world. The real world is one of plenty. The real world is one of sophistication in industry, automation, robotics, advanced control. We have raw materials, we have the machinery to have a world of abundance. And yet here it is, we're struggling we're struggling here, we're struggling there because of the policy of the financial system. We need to alter that, and we need to actually, if you like, regain control of the narrative. And the first regaining control is to actually agree to be demesmerized and look at the natural world instead of this sort of synthetic, abstract world that's created through the mainstream media. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck?
Well, C.H. Douglas said Christianity is meaningless without the incarnation. And by that he meant that just taking thought or just saying words is not adequate. We have an environment we've been given. It's a fantastic environment that enables us to improve our lot constantly, and we have a responsibility to do this. And you look at all these rioters in the United States and you say, do these people have any potential to do something useful with the resources of the earth? And it's obvious they're the last people you could imagine doing that. We've had marvelous inventions and discoveries, and these were done by people who were incarnating the word. They were actually creating something of use to humanity that improved its position. Now, there were perhaps side effects of this that weren't so beneficial, but they were things that we could easily have dispensed with if we had applied ourselves to doing that. You know, pollution and that sort of thing. That can be dealt with. But there are many, many Christians who don't believe in the incarnation, it seems, because they say that all you have to do is pray and wait. And I don't think that is Christianity at all. Jesus said, why don't you do what I say? In the Lord's Prayer, it says, give us this day our daily bread. And the final line in that, thy kingdom, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. These are practical things. And the idea that we should just be waiting to be raptured, I don't know why we would be merited to be raptured in particular, but the purpose of our existence on earth is to do good things, to purify our thinking, to make ourselves wiser and better people. And this is all practical. This is all practical things. So, you know, for thousands of years, people have been imagining that the end of the world is at hand. And you hear so many people saying that today. Well, I think it's just some kind of a manifestation of narcissism and ego, because they think they are so important that they have to be there for the final resolution of the fate of the universe. But it's not something that we should be concerned about. We should be concerned about doing good and, in particular, freeing ourselves from the dictatorship of finance that has brought ruin to the world. It's brought world wars. It's brought revolutions. It's brought killing of unborn children, all sorts of things like that. It's just a negative influence, and our job is to make constructive use of the resources in the world, to be on good relations with all people in the world, to respect their differences, to value their differences, and this is where we should be heading.
Thank you for that, Robert. That's beautifully put, and certainly challenging. To value the differences, we're not the same. I find that a profound statement, and with the word equality, to me, equality It's a bogus word. Equality. No two people are the same. A male and a female are different biologically, physically, anatomically, even down to the point of their cells, but so is a male to a male. We are entirely different. We are unique. Our fingerprints, our irises, our eyes, our skin, our thoughts, our processes, our strengths, our weaknesses. Every part of us is unique. And this is the point, that in that uniqueness we can actually, the individual can aspire within that uniqueness to do something completely different. And I noted that if you like the history of war, there's a medal handed out very rarely in Australia called the Victoria Cross, the Supreme Acts of Valour. Now, if we're all equal, then that would mean that obviously everyone would get the Victoria Cross, whereas we're not equal. Individuals aspire and they do things that are quite unique. Rockets, was it Robinson's? No, the steam engine developer and all that.
James what?
It is Stephenson's rocket. Stephenson's rocket. It is. There it is.
Yeah, that was
And even just to the point of saying, okay, we've harnessed steam and we've got it in the boiler. Now, can we actually convert that steam into reciprocating engines? And then if we can, we've got it in reciprocating engines. Why can't we put that onto a movable device? And that, of course, was Stephenson's rocket. That's what he did. He converted heat energy into steam, steam into reciprocating energy, ultimately rotating energy. And there it was. You had a mobile device called a train. One individual thinking outside the box. And of course, our history, our cultural inheritance is of thousands and thousands of unique individuals. Think of Mozart, think of Beethoven, where did that music come from? Where did it come from? And of course, artists, great artists and great writers, poets and thinkers, philosophers, where did those thoughts come from? Each one expressing their uniqueness. We are not the same. We are not common. We are not equal. We are diverse. And so it is not only with individuals, but also with races. Our race compared to another. And what is our race? And what is it made up of? A conglomeration of different peoples come together in space and time under an agreement we call our culture. Our historical thoughts and processes, all of these things. So our culture is unique in comparison to other cultures, and the diversity that's there in those other cultures, is that a weakness or is it a strength? And should they be proud or ashamed? And these things, of course, this is the mark of the maker. And in that diversity, in that, if you like, expression of uniqueness, is that you can't have clones, and yet, if you like, our bureaucratic or totalitarian governments treat us as clones. Matter in motion and no spiritual facet whatsoever. And of course, this is all false. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck. I know I've taken us off the mark, but I'll give you the floor back, Wally.
No, it's really it's astounding. Actually, it is such a profound subject. And equality, the idea of creating equality, is behind virtually all of the propaganda that you hear these days. And all of it is directed at the control of individual human beings from an external source. Because you cannot have equality. The natural tendency is diversity. We have imaginations, we have souls, we have minds. We are supposed to be looking for what was promised, life and life more abundant. Now, if you're going to have life more abundant, that takes progress. That takes development. It means things have to happen. But if you have an egalitarian society, nothing is going to happen. It's static. Because in the first place, you'll be so tied up with legalism, trying to determine what equality is, that you won't have any time to do anything constructive anyway. And you'll be in constant conflict. And society will just be rife with discontent and completely unproductive turmoil. It is based upon futility, a lack of faith. It is based upon envy. It is based upon resentment. And none of these things lead to anything constructive. And, equality, who wants to, honestly speaking, do any of you want to be equal with someone else? Do you think that anyone else really wants to be equal with you? I think the term, it's the question of adequacy, abundance that is important, not equality, because equality will just lead to a regimented society and the end of human freedom and possibly the end of human life on the planet if it's carried far enough. It's already caused enormous suffering in the Soviet Union and places where it's alleged but bogus equality has been attempted to, has been made the prevailing social value. It's just absolutely profoundly disturbing how we have been led away from a proper and a constructive and a happy, an approach to life that brings happy outcomes, good outcomes, by all of this mischievous nonsense. And Bob was talking about people who seem to be inclined to be just passive and waiting for a final outcome, the rapture or something of them. It's, this is completely, certainly contrary to social credit philosophy, because we want to encourage within each individual his greatest potential. And that potential will lead him or her in different directions and to different achievements, all to the enrichment of society and civilization and to the enhancement of our accumulating cultural heritage. But burning down buildings and tearing down statues and trying to discredit the whole basis of society, good and not only bad, but good as well, is hardly a way to build. It's only a way to tear down and to destroy. This is all destructive philosophy, destructive policy, and it's playing upon people who probably, if they had the right influences, would be happy and constructively engaged in life. But they're being sabotaged, they're being exploited, they're being used, and their energies are being directed to destructive ends instead of, and it's all aimed at pulling down and destroying the existing cultural heritage that we have so painfully, and yet with profit developed over the ages. And to take it all down is a terribly arrogant and a terribly conceited project, because I would like to know what these people who are so especially engaged in their destructive activities would have produced if they had been in the position of our ancestors. I don't think they would have produced anything like our ancestors did, in fact, produce.
I'm going to jump in here, Wally, because I know where you're going on this, and I think that there needs to be an explanation to those very people who are involved, if you like, in the revolution. And I'm limited in my understanding of it because I don't have the education, but I do know that the educational system has been instrumental in painting this whole false narrative, this whole prejudice, if you like, towards the success of past generations, of past cultures, and to deconstruct it violently in order to rebuild it based on a utopia or a hope of utopia. And of course that whole narrative is a lie. It's based on a lie. And of course the Marxists are, if you like, the active Marxists in the demonstrations, and who are ripping down statues and burning and looting and tearing them apart. They're actually not producing any answer except one of violence and one of power, to deconstruct in order to hand power to an external authority. So they are actually doing the bidding of someone else. They're not doing the bidding of themselves. They're not doing the benefit for themselves. They're actually, out of envy tearing things apart, and destroying other people's lives, because that's who it affects. You start destroying someone's department store and ripping all the stock out, and it's strewn in the streets, and it's wasted. And the amount of pain and suffering that store owner, who might be just living on a threadbare existence, and here it is, you've taken it upon yourself as just some type of self-righteous judge of all to tear these things apart. And of course it goes back to, in my view, it's a political question that's gone, it's a cultural and political question that's gone back many years to the actual placing of these, if you like, revolutionaries within our education system. And that goes back a long, long way, at least the last 50 years. Because I know they were surfacing 50 years ago when I was a student, a young, if you like, junior school student. And as I went on to the senior school, I noticed that they were surfacing then, that the education system was changing and these people were being placed into a position of power or influence. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck, because I know that you've got a lot of inside running on this subject.
Well, I had the same experience, Arnie. I was in university 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago now. And I was studying history. I was at one point concentrating on mathematics. I found that the mathematics professors were not very ideological. But when I got into the history field, I found that practically every professor I had was a Marxist. And I went to their offices, and I was asking them questions that brought this out. And I realized what their orientation was. And it was, quite something when you got 75 or 80% of the professors in a department who are Marxists. That isn't exactly the proportion of Marxists in the general society. So obviously there was a program of subversion going on then. I guess that these intellectuals had captured departments like that. I think it was even worse in departments like sociology. And I don't know about economics. Probably economics was pretty bad as well. But, we look at what we've referred to as the cultural heritage. And when you do that and you study the incremental steps that led to the fantastic technological knowledge and capacity we have today. And it's just an exciting thing. And then I consider these people out in the streets rioting, and I think they're just not in the area that should be exciting our imaginations and our creativity. They're missing the boat completely. And the thing is that the cultural heritage that was developed, well, largely in Europe. There were other civilizations too. And if you look at ancient civilizations, there are some great mysteries in that. It gives you pause. But China had an advanced civilization. A number of countries were like that. The Aztecs and the Mayans, amazing achievements. But this capacity for production developed primarily in Europe. And that is our cultural heritage. But it's not only our cultural heritage. Now it's a cultural heritage for the world. That knowledge is available to any population that wants to make use of it. And so there was certainly a problem with the way European influence spread through the world. I don't think it can possibly be denied that there was a lot of brutality and a lot of injustice even. Not worse than in other civilizations, but still there were problems, and it's legitimate to criticize them. But what happened was the European countries were driven by this corrupt financial system. And the evil things that they might have done in spreading their civilization around the world was compulsive. It was the result of having to contend with this debt system and having to compete in a completely unnatural and forced way among each other for markets. And I was reading a memoir written by the Kaiser. As Kaiser was dethroned in the First World War, and I was reading something he wrote, and he said that they had always assumed in Germany that before the First World War that there would be competition, but it would be peaceful competition. But he said, unfortunately, we Germans had the latest technology, and it was succeeding better than the older British technology was. And therefore, there was a conflict and a competition for markets. You can't just make use of your production within your country. For some reason, you have to export it. And the reason is because of this debt system. We're always trying to pay the cumulative debts. And so every society is in extreme competition with every other. And the result of the competition to acquire markets is inevitably war, because the pressures are constantly increasing. So there's no reason for us not to be living in comfort that is accessible to every citizen. And if it's a case that there is some country that is not doing so well, we have so much capacity that we should be able to send some people over there to help them out, because we shouldn't be thinking, well, they're going to become our competitors and we have to prevent them from developing so that we'll be able to sell our products successfully, and we'll prevent them from doing so. In the first place, why do you want to sell your production? Why don't you use your production domestically? Why don't you distribute it to the people who are involved in its production? This competition for markets is completely artificial and compulsive, because it's dictated by the effects of the financial system we're living under. So that has to be corrected. And people have to realize that this is the fundamental problem in our society. Now, we're threatened with something that they're calling a great reset. And Wally was talking about equality. Well, the only equality we're going to have is a thrusting down of the standard of living. I haven't heard anybody talking about, in the context of this great reset, of spreading prosperity to more people. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about controls and limiting technologies that they disapprove of. And this will all result in people being thrust down the scale of existence. And I really do think that if you want a vision of the future, very, very conceivably, it's what George Orwell described in 1984. That was a dead level of equality. It was a dreadfully boring, depressing, colorless existence. And that, it seems, is what is being planned for us. And we shouldn't think that the people who are involved in running the world at the present time would refrain from imposing that on us, because there's every evidence that they are, if not controlled and therefore under the influence of some esoteric power, then they are actually psychopathic themselves. And if you studied history, you know what psychopaths can do to a society. We don't want to get in that position, and unfortunately, we seem to be heading there full tilt.
Thank you for that, Robert. I want to actually just open the floor because I think that let's place ourselves in the shoes, if you like, of the people in the streets who are demonstrating. They themselves may have no future. They may have incurred massive student debts They may see that there are no job prospects because their jobs are handed over to third world nations or robots or automation. They have no means of actually achieving a meaningful life. Now, these to me are real observations and real considerations. And the fact is, there is a solution, there is an answer. And for this, I'm going to ask Wallace Klinck to give his thoughts, give the audience his thoughts. Wallace.
Well, yes, Arnie, of course, these young people are being exploited. They're under the control of their managers, their educators, and the cultural influences that have been literally imposed upon them through their educational experiences. And it is a tragedy because they have no vision, no hope, no faith of the potential wonderful life that is absolutely achievable and waiting to burst out. But you know, there is a problem. We have, the Old Testament says from the beginning that we will spend, because we're bad people, we will spend the rest of our days earning our living by the sweat of our brows, and life is going to be miserable. Well, as you can readily see, the Christian era brought a completely different approach to that. This was one of abundance. This was one of love. This was one of endless good things. Now, if you have no hope, you are going to, because your natural tendency as a living being is to live. And if you see or sense that your opportunities for living are minimal or even diminishing, or that they are not adequate because somebody is exploiting you, well, then obviously you're going to respond in some way. And if some ideologue can get a hold of you, they can direct your energies in a manner which may be helpful or it may be highly destructive. And so far, the manner in which these basically communist-oriented ideologies have driven people is to violence and resistance, destruction, resentment, no hope. Blaming your neighbor for your problems. And we all know where that has led in the past. Not only to nowhere, but to the creation of dreadfully oppressive and tragic situations. So, but there is something about this philosophy or this condemnation that we're under, that life is supposed to be miserable, that that makes there is something in the human being naturally. You don't fare well when you are threatened, because you have a desire to live and a will to live and survive. So there's a tendency for you to blame somebody else, some other factor, some people, for your essential problems in life. And we have been taught that there is essential scarcity. As a matter of fact, orthodox economics, as opposed to social credit, actually teaches. Its structure is based on the theory of scarcity, the distribution of scarce resources. It's a lie. It's a lie, a lie, a lie. Unless you perceive that the only purpose in life is perpetual economic activity with no time to breathe, no time to pause, it makes no sense. It's illogical. It's not scientific. And it is malevolent. So we simply, we've been misled by this. And what it is, it's led to a suspicion of your neighbor, a condemnation of your neighbor, when you think that your scarcity or your problems are due to his laziness, his indolence. So this creates a dreadful social and spiritual, cultural environment in which people live. It's amazing that so many people do retain their humanity to the extent that they do under the stresses they are placed. It really is. As Douglas said, if people react in an unfavorable manner because they're annoyed, well, perhaps it might be a good idea to stop annoying them. Well, if the abundance that is really available to them were revealed to them, and they could see it and had faith in it, they would not be annoyed. They would be pleased and happy and joyous in partaking in the experience of life. But you see, everything is a crisis. Everything is a crisis. If you listen to the news, it's crisis, 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 one after the other, decade after decade. And so that faith is destroyed. Faith is diminished and destroyed. And that cannot lead to any positive developments in society, because I can't get out of bed in the morning without faith. You can't do anything without faith. It's not some kind of a mysterious delusion. It's the essence of life. And so we have, I think, some kind of a very malevolent influence. Bob referred to something perhaps that is a little beyond what we would regard as natural causes. I don't know about that, but I do know that it's at work, whatever it is, it's at work in society. And it is appearing to be a very destructive influence, which is not entirely too extravagant to imagine it could eventually destroy us, because we have developed enormous technology, but that technology is a tool, and it's the way it's used is good or bad. And if we use it for bad, we're placing ourselves in extreme jeopardy. But I think, when you hear people talk about others as useless eaters, that's not a very Christian attitude. And yet it's put forth as a moral certitude. Don't need these lazy people around. They've got to be working. Even if it's fighting wars and destroying each other, they've got to be working. Because after all, the only moral thing in life is to be working under somebody else's direction for some specified or unspecified purpose in which the directors have a vested interest. And, well, you can see where that leads. It's just to a slave society, basically, and to a suppressed society. I was in the Soviet Union, and I saw old buildings near the city. They looked like they were pre-revolutionary. They looked like they'd never been painted or repaired in all that time. You saw on airplanes, you would see the local people. And I must say that I had the sensation that they were, you might say, dispirited, sort of spiritually or psychologically repressed and depressed, that there was a lack of hope in their countenance. Their faces didn't show joy. And this is where we're headed if something is not done to reverse the situation. And a financial system that makes sure that all production is financed by new credits is needed. But those credits must be forthcoming when they're based on the resources that people have, and they're willing to put those resources to a purposeful program. And above all, in the modern economy, under our present system of accountancy and finance, a financial system that ensures that the results of the deployment of resources for accomplishment, that the results flow automatically to the public at large. People work, and they're entitled to be paid for their work. But their work is a minor portion of the effort, the energy that goes into production today from non-human sources. Now, I don't think people should be paid for those resources in the way that we do. They should be an inheritance to which everyone is entitled. And people have the notion that if you're going to share in society, it's going to be at their expense or somebody's expense. Somebody wants to steal from them. Well, if nature and our history, our cultural heritage, have contributed so much quite independently of current labor, then how can you come to such a conclusion? It's something that is encouraged to generate strife in society, resentment and hostility and sterility, because it doesn't lead to anything good. So there is some kind of an evil influence that is working upon human attitudes, which is very, very counter to the type of society that we could have, very demonstrably, and certainly a society that even resembles a Christian-oriented society. And somehow, I don't know what we're going to have to do, but we're going to have to get to the bottom of this. And Douglas certainly pointed to the key technical and philosophical issues that were at issue, but for some reason we have been held in fear of the next disaster, scarcity. And that has generated in us, they say, a negative attitude toward our fellow man, because we're always looking for some kind of a reason and a scapegoat, when it's all based on an artificial specter that is held before us to influence us, to brainwash us, to mislead us psychologically, and to impair not only our philosophical attitudes and spiritual attitudes, but our actual physical aptitudes, because it has a detrimental effect on human association, on the quality of human association. And after all, human association is the way in which we have brought to fruition many of the developments that we have. So anything that sabotages that is detrimental to it and will only lead to a depressed standard of living, a standard of attitudes in the society, a lack of love, and just plain ruination. And that's what we're being subject to. And believe me, what we're undergoing now is an attack on what we had acquired in the past. And I don't think, you notice that these people who are always trying to damn us for everything we've done, for even being, do they ever really talk about what they are going to do to rectify the situation, other than making us all equal? I don't hear it.
Thank you for that, Wally. That's it's a profound observation, and quite, if you like, it's distinct in the sense that you're pointing to the root cause, and to me the issue that we've got to, in order to close out today's forum, is to provide some hope, and that hope in itself is actually within each individual. To me, if you look to a leader, a spiritual leader, political, industrial, whatever, I think they can become a target for enormous amounts of pressure, external pressure, whether it's as malevolent as blackmail or even execution, if you like. But the point is that if that leader stands up, they run that risk. And in my view, the politicians today can be the barrier between you and totalitarianism. And so you've got to consider the validity of the individual, your representative. Are they actually your representative, or are they doing the bidding of someone else, an external influence? And you've got to actually shore them up. And that is, you've got to reinforce your position to the point where they have to yield. The will of the electorate, not the will of the mob, the will of the electorate, the will of the individual, when the individual takes the time to think. We've got our website, we've got our resources, we've got thousands of documents to re-educate yourself, to actually reorientate your thinking and place it back on an even keel. Looking at the natural world, it is one of plenty. It is one of, if you like, there are no shortages. You know, a good example is the Murray-Darling River, and how easy in a sense, we took on a project called the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme, and we turned rivers inland. The Snowy River can go either straight out to sea, or it can actually go back into the Murray-Darling and generate power. We've done it before. And the thing is that with our productive capacity, using that water, we're reaching, if you like, a ceiling and saying, well, we want a certain amount for flow, we want a certain amount for environment, a certain amount for industry. We may need more. And the political will is to provide more. We've got the northern rivers that can do this, the political will. So there isn't a shortage. There is no natural...
I agree with you, Arnie. I agree with you. I hope that there is enough latent decency in the producing class to respond to a normal situation when they themselves are not constantly under increasing pressure from this oppressive financial system.
That's right, exactly right. Because when we mentioned at the start of this forum, the cash flow crisis for the middle class, what that Victorian government, or at least the executive of that government, is doing, is they are destroying the middle class, those business people who are trying to make ends meet, who are trying to balance their books. And this is a malevolent act. This isn't an act to benefit those people. This is an act to destroy those people. Their justification is COVID-19, of which the morbidity is such that it's no different than a seasonal flu. In fact, the numbers are lower. There's no justification for what's going on, but they're doing it. The response, in my mind, is the individual. What I'm saying is, if you rely entirely on your politician or the great Superman to come out of nowhere and do it, you're deluded. It's actually down to you. The methods that they're using are such that they are emasculating, if you like, the equivalent of King John, barons of 1215. They're emasculating the church, they're emasculating the barons. So neither of those can actually respond. The only people left are the individuals. The individuals. There is a proposal that provides if you like, a mathematical solution. And that's all this is. It's an accountancy solution to what's actually going on, to eliminate debt, to provide sufficient purchasing power in the hands of the individual that they can actually survive, and survive comfortably. And if they want to go further, they can. They can receive greater reward. That's entirely up to them. But at the moment, it's being deprived of them. And this is Marxism, this is totalitarianism. This is what the lockdown is about. And it's stifling discussion, it's stifling debate. You can't even go out and speak to your neighbour. You can't do all of these things. You've got to wear a mask. You've got to be stifled from your thinking, your talking, your facial expressions, all the things that you use in order to communicate. This is what's going on. Victoria, you've got to look hard at this, but the rest of the world, so do you. Because what's being done in Victoria is the testing ground for what people will accept through brainwashing, what they'll accept. And that's why I say that balcony's there. Find your own balcony and throw your TV off and start thinking and start doing your own re-education. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, if people doubt the capacity of our modern productive plant to deliver abundance, they should just reflect on the history of the 20th century. We had a world war that destroyed Europe. And subsequent to that, that involved the creation of millions, tens of millions of bombs and cannons and tanks and huge productive effort, unprecedented, something that hadn't been seen in peacetime. All of a sudden, war comes along and you can produce basically whatever you want, it seems. And after all that production that was turned to destructive purposes and left a continent in ruins, they were able to rebuild that continent. And they did a pretty good job of it before they had another war. And in that war, they went into this incredible productive frenzy again, and they built warships and cannons and aircraft of all, tens of thousands of aircraft, just for the purpose of the war, in order to destroy Europe again. And then after the war, they succeeded fairly well in rebuilding Europe, even though after both those wars, there were periods of austerity and rationing imposed on people that hadn't been known during the course of the wars, when people were relatively prosperous because there was lots of economic activity and it was easy to get a job, and even a decent paying job. Then the end of the war came, and no more war production, so it was relatively hard to find employment. But the capacity for production was revealed in the course of those events should fire your imagination, and you should think what would have happened if all that energy, all those resources had been turned to constructive purposes instead of just the ones between the war. Because there has been so much waste, so much destruction in human history, and the 20th century was a really good period for studying this, that it's just obvious that our capacity is practically beyond imagination. The problem is to turn it to constructive ends. But this financial system we're burdened with is always making us become enemies of our neighbors and competitors in an extreme form with our neighbors. And this leads to conflict and destruction. So I find it remarkable, too, that Hollywood is always producing, constantly producing films that are dystopic. They show a world ruined from some sort of world war or nuclear cataclysm. Well, why are they pushing this idea out into the population? Nobody should be thinking about this. We should be thinking of building a great society in which everybody has access to what they need to have a good life and opportunities to pursue their own interests and develop their capacities in many directions.
Beautifully put. I call that an opportunity for leisure, Robert, and an opportunity to actually expand your thinking, your education, your philosophical perspective on life. Take up music, take up the sciences, take up the arts. Let the machines do the work. Who cares? As long as you have sufficiency. And that's what this is about. The financial system robs you of that, and it's deceitful from the start. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Wallace Klinck.
Well, I didn't think you were going to ask me for another opinion, but I certainly agree with you. Arnie, when you measure leisure, it's have been said that leisure is the mother of all culture. In other words, the lack of leisure, if you reverse that, is a tendency toward barbarism. During the wars that you mentioned, people were busy. They were busy, but it wasn't a constructive type of activity. But during relatively peaceful episodes, in Europe, for instance, you had an affluence of writers, of music, the arts. It's just, when people have freedom from necessity, external to their real interests and aptitudes, they really do tend to produce some amazing, rewarding, and things which elevate the human spirit. And we were not meant, You don't see in nature a frenzy of competitive economic activity. You see natural processes taking place to serve the needs of the various organisms which exist. We seem to be the prime example, a horrible example of hyper activity for the sake of chasing an abstraction called money. And it really is quite insane. If money reflected reality, then I guess you'd have to accept it that at least it reflected reality. But it doesn't. It's the fact that it doesn't reflect reality that we are forced, absolutely compelled, to seek money first among all things in order that we might enjoy other things. And this is, money is a marvelous invention, and structured properly so that it has the capacity to deliver what is being produced constantly, dynamically to all the different people who compose society. It's a marvelous invention, probably the most marvelous invention of all, because it should allow complete freedom of association amongst human beings. But it hasn't been used that way. It's been kept scarce in order to give the possessors of the ability to create credit, which we use as money. People don't generally seem to understand, even now, although it's been mentioned during this talk. I mean, even back in the 40s, I believe it was, during financial hearings in Canada, the finance ministers, I guess it was the Bank of Canada's governor, said people might not like to know that banks create money. But it was also said during those hearings that if people want to change the system, it is within their purview to do so. But you see, money has been kept scarce relative to reality because you give an artificial value to something that is artificially scarce. And it is that artificiality of money that gives those who control its issue the power that they hold over humanity, human destiny, and human action. And so it's been perverted and used to the wrong purpose. Some people want to get rid of money. That's not the solution in the modern world. You can't do that. And there's no reason why you should even want to. We need an honest system which allows production at its maximal and optimal rate with regard to quantity and quality, and we need a financial system that automatically allows the results that flow from association and production to go out to the community, to every individual. You shouldn't be restricted in your access to the ability to get some job that may or may not be pleasant, and in any case is difficult to obtain or impossible to obtain, and you're thrown on welfare in a humiliating way because you're prevented from really doing what your natural instincts and capabilities would lead to. And it's really, the evil of the system really is beyond my capacity to verbalize.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Wallace. That's certainly a challenging perspective on the if you like, the fraudulent money system. We've covered a lot. This is our longest broadcast to date, but I think it's also one of our most important. The Administrative Era, Series 5. This is Arnis Luks at the Crossroads. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Wallace.
Thanks, Arnie.